Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf Hey finally leaves the Agadata behind and goes into halachos of how you measure the borders of a city. Again, what we're trying to do here is figure out how to draw the borders of the city in order to figure out how to draw the tchum of the city. So as we have seen in our Mishnah, which will be expanded on in the Brisa here, you draw the borders by making straight lines, and you expand as far as the city sticks out in many directions. That means you very leniently draw the borders. You add a lot of space to the city in order to make those straight lines. So if there is a small piece of the city that sticks out, that'll push the straight line of the city much further out and add a lot of land to the city. Then you actually draw the borders when you actually draw the tchum, so you're adding 2,000 amas to the borders that you drew very leniently. So what we're going to have here is a brisa, which will discuss how you draw the borders in various different shaped cities. And again, what we're trying to do is draw very even, lenient borders, very straight lines, as square or as rectangular as we can. So we're going to be stretching these borders as much as we can. The Gemara will discuss a number of different shapes of cities and how you set up their borders. Then we're going to get to what type of structures that can actually push the borders out further. Not every structure on the outskirts of a city counts as part of the city to push the border out. And we'll list the various different types of structures, which ones count and which ones do not. And near the end of the daf, we'll get back to some more Agadata, discussing people who live a wandering existence. So first of all, we have a brisa here that has various different shapes of cities and how you draw their borders. So the brisa says as follows: if you have a rectangular city, so you draw it the way it is. You don't have to do anything with the borders. Those borders, the natural borders, are what their borders are. If it's a city with circular borders, then you make a square around it. If it is square, so then you don't do anything to it. You just leave it the way it is. You don't add corners to it. It's not like a circular city where you square it off. Now, if it is wider than it is long, if it is wider on one end than it is on the other end, that means that it looks like a trapezoid. It has two parallel sides across from each other, but one of them is longer and one of them is shorter. So it's kind of like a triangle with one of the corners of the triangle chopped off. So in a case like that, so what you do is you square it off. You expand the angled sides so that you have right angles and it becomes square on all sides. Now if you have a house that sticks out of the basic lines of the city, that house causes the border to be pushed further out all along that line. Same thing applies if you have two houses. The Gemara will ask what the chiddush of two houses is if you've already discussed one. If you have a city shaped like a bow, that is like an arch, or a city shaped like a gamma, that's our chaf sofis, or like a letter L, so then you fill in the space of inside the arch, or the space that would be enclosed by the two sides of the L. You fill in that entire space. You view it as if it is all a settled part of the city, that is all considered to be part of the city. You square it off, and then you extend the city past that. Gemara now works through each of these one at a time. The Gemara wants to know what the chiddush is. The Gemara says, you said if it's rectangular, you don't have to do anything to it. The Gemara says, obviously, if it's rectangular, why would I think you should do anything to it? Why should I push the borders out further? The Gemara says, you may think that you need to square it off. And it has to be actually square with even lengths on its width and on its length. It should be square in the sense, not just that it has right angles, but it should be square in the sense that its sides are all even. That is what I would have thought the chiddush here is. You don't have to do that, you just have to have right angles. Then we said if it's square, you just leave it, you don't square it off. And which is why I would think you squared off. It's square already. The Gemara says it's square, but it's not perfectly square to the directions of the earth. Meaning it's not flat facing north, flat south, flat east, and flat west. Its corners are facing, let's say, north, south, east, and west. So you may think that I should draw another square around it where the actual square that I'm going to draw is going to be lined up north, south, east, and west. The chiddush is you don't do that. You just need squares. It doesn't matter what directions they are aligned to. Now we said if you have one house or two that sticks out of the wall, so that pushes the entire side out further. You draw a straight line from that house, from that furthest point where it sticks out. That's where you draw your line to include that piece that sticks out. So the Gemara says, why do you need to tell me if there are two things that stick out? For sure, if there are two that stick out, you would push the border out. If there's one you do, so two you for sure do. The Gemara says the chiddush is that the two are not on the same side. They're on opposite sides, and the chiddush is that you could even push out the borders on more than one side at a time. Okay, now we're going to discuss the length halacha of the bow, that's the archway. So we're going to talk about a city shaped like an arch. The Gemara refers to it as the bow and the string. The bow would be the city itself, that's the shape, it's an arch-shaped city. The string would be, if you view it as a bow, as in a bow and arrow, so the line that you would draw from the two ends of the bow would be sort of like the string. That would be the place where a string would be if it was actually a string. So we're going to refer to that as the string. Now we said that the halacha is that you draw the border from the string, you don't draw the border from the bow itself, which is the only actual part of the city. You view the space within the bow as if it is filled in, and therefore you draw the border from the city. Same thing applies if you have a city that's shaped like an L. An L-shaped city, you fill in the space within the opening of the L, and you draw the border that way. So the Gemara says, a statement of Rav Huna. Rav Huna says, this halacha, that you draw the border from the string and you view the entire within the area of the archway as if it's all filled in, that only applies if from the two legs of the bow, meaning across the length of the string, is less than 4,000 amos. That means that the ends of the bow of the city are within each other's tchum. They overlap. If you were to draw a tchum from one end leg to the other end leg, they would overlap. The tchumen would meet. That's why we view it as one big city. And I draw the borders around it, where the string would be, and then I extend the tchumen outwards from there. If, however, it is more than 4,000 amos, their tchumen would not overlap, then I draw the borders of the city as it is. I don't fill in the open part of the archway, and I draw regular tchumen from the arched-shaped city itself. So the Gemara asks, but this is a different place where Rav Huna said, you have a city that is shaped like an arch, or it's shaped in a certain way, and part of the wall and some of the houses fell down, so that you have a gap created within the city. So then the open area has to be 141 and a third amos or less in order for it to be considered one city as far as drawing the borders of it. If it is greater than 141 and a third amos, then it's considered to be two separate areas. You wouldn't fill in the gap when drawing the borders. Now, where does this number come from? So 70 and 2/3 is the length of a karfeif, and that is how we define the outskirts of a city. A city itself gets a border around it of 70 and 2/3 amos, which is considered part of the city. Any house within that area is considered to be part of the city. Here you have a gap that was created inside an existing city, twice the length of a karfeif. Twice 70 and 2/3 is 141 and a third, meaning we give a karfeif length to each end, and if those two karfeif lengths, if that strip around the city as wide as a karfeif, 70 and 2/3 amos, if that strip overlaps in this place where it fell down, then I would still consider it to be one city. That's why the gap has to be 141 and a third amos and not greater. Either way, that's a significantly smaller number than 4,000 amos, which is what Rav Huna is saying here. So which is it to make it viewed as if the city is one? Does it have to be within 4,000 amos, the legs of the arch, or does it have to be within 141 and a third amos? What is the halach over here? So the Gemara answers that it depends what we are talking about. If the city was completely divided into two, the gap that was created goes all the way through across the length of the city, across the width of the city, then it's got to be within 141 and a third amos, because we view it as two separate cities. The only way it's viewed as one is if their strip of the border around it, if those overlap and they're two karfifin overlap, and you have 141 and a third. If, however, it's one large city that's shaped like an arch, then it's enough if they're within 4,000 amos of each other. So Gemara says, so then what exactly is the chiddush of the statement of Rav Huna in the case of the 141 and a third amma? That the chiddush seems to be that you give the 70 and 2/3 on both cities, both ends, both new areas. They each get to measure 70 and 2/3 amos. They each get to measure the length of their karfeif, their border area. That's part of the city. And if they overlap, it's okay. You don't count as one border between the two, that the two have to be within 70 and 2/3. You give them each side gets their own width. And if they overlap, that's okay. Well, that seems to be his chiddush, but that's not a chiddush because he had already said that halacha before. Like we've seen in a different discussion, we have a Mishnah that says that when you have cities like this, So you give a karfef area between them, according to Rabbi Meir. And the Chachamim say, no, you only give a karfef area if you have two completely separate cities near each other. And how much is this karfef area that Rabbi Meir says? So Rav Huna says you give one karfef to each side, meaning you have twice the length of a karfef, in order to, for the two cities or the two areas to be considered to be overlapping and to be joined into one. And Rav Chia says, no, you only give one karfef width for them. So you see here, Rav Huna said clearly in another place that you give twice the length of a karfef. Why does he have to say it there? And why does he have to say it here again in this case of the houses that fell down? It's the same halacha. You give twice the width of a karfef in order to be able to consider the two cities to be overlapped and one city itself. Where it says he needs to say it twice because in one case we are talking about one city where houses and walls fell down and a gap was created within a city, dividing it into two separate cities. That's one place where he's discussing when the two ends are considered to be joined into one, and the other one is you have two separate cities that were always separate and were never considered combined to one, and both of them are a chiddush. Why are they both a chiddush? First of all, in the case where it was never considered combined, it's harder to combine them. Halachically, it's a bigger chiddush to say that you can combine them. So I may think there that you would need to have only one karfef width, and here, and only in the case where you have one that you're trying to keep together because walls fell down, there you would be able to have twice a karfef width. So that's a chiddush one way, and the chiddush the other way is that if you have two separate cities, each city gets its own space. The space around the city, the 70 and 2/3 amos around the city, is considered part of the city because people in a city need that range. They need that area around the city. It's part of the things that they need to use. They need that space. And therefore, if you have two separate cities, I understand the people there need space. They need that area. So I would understand that each city gets a 70 and 2/3 width, and you can combine the two of them and still consider it to be joined. However, if you have one city and a space fell down in between, they're not used to having space there. They don't need that space. I may think that you don't give them each two separate spaces. It was never two cities that each had its own space. They don't need that extra space, and therefore I might think they don't have that extra space. And that is why we are saying this chiddush over here. Arna asks, what's the halacha? How far is it allowed to be from the top arch of the bow, the arch-shaped city, all the way down to the imaginary string of the arch-shaped city? How far is it allowed to be that space and still consider it to be one large city and measure the tchum from the string? So Gemara brings two opinions. Gemara says Rabba bar Rav Huna says it can't be more than 2,000 amos, and his son Rava said it should be any share. It doesn't matter the size. The Gemara says Abaye agreed with that. Rava, he felt that it shouldn't make a difference what the size is because you could get to the string area anyway by walking through the arches of the city, and therefore it shouldn't matter how far it is. The Gemara considers that to be halachic, and the Gemara leaves it that way. Okay, now we go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah had listed a number of different structures which count as houses as part of the city to push the borders further outward. The Gemara wants to know what are gedudiyos. One of the things on the list are gedudiyos. So Yehuda says it is broken houses that have three walls, and even if they don't have a roof. The Gemara says, what if it has two walls and a roof? Does that count or not? The Gemara says, let me bring you proof from a lengthy brisa. The Gemara will later analyze the brisa more specifically. The brisa lists a number of structures that count to push the borders of the city further outward. All of them have to have some sort of space for people to live in. And here is the list. These are the things which expand the borders. The Gemara says if you have a structure of some sort which goes over a grave, it is 4 amos by 4 amos minimum, and it's a place for a watchman to sit and watch the grave. Or a gesher or a kever, those are watch structures for a cemetery. As long as they have a place for a watchman, it counts to expand the borders of the city. A shul, which has a place for the chazan to live, that's the shamish, to live in the city. A lahavdel, a church or avodah zarah building that has a space for their priests to sit. A horse barn that has a place for the watcher to sit, and storehouses of grain that are in the fields that have a place for watchmen to sit. All these count only if they have places for watchmen. However, huts and temporary structures such as that count. Those automatically have a place for someone to live in. You don't have to add that. And also a house on an island in the sea, that counts as long as the house is within 70 and 2/3 amos of the city itself, and these count to expanded. Now these are the ones that do not count. Structure over a grave which doesn't have any living space in it, or a house which had its walls fall down on two ends. That's going to be what our proof is from. But we'll get to that. First, we have to finish the brisa. The gesher and the kev that don't have a space for a watchman, a shul that doesn't have a space for the shamish to live, and a desire house that doesn't have space for the priests to live, a barn or storehouses in the fields that don't have any place for watchmen to live, a cave, a pit, or a trench of some sort that doesn't have a place for anybody to live. That's not spelled out, but that's there. And a fence or a birdhouse. Again, these have no place for people to live. Or a house that's on a boat. The boat doesn't have a set place, and therefore you can't count to expand your city. All these don't count to expand the city. Anyway, so it proves from the fact that we said over here that if a wall fell down on two ends, that seems to indicate that even if you have only two walls left, as long, even though you have a roof, it should still not count, and it does not expand the city. So the question is, who told you that this is referring to when there's a roof? Maybe it's talking about when there's no roof, and when there is a roof, it does count to expand the city. Okay, that ends that proof. The Gemara now wants to know about some of the things that we had here on the list. So we said a house in the sea, on an island in the sea. What's that worth? What are you going to do with that? So our Papa says that is when a boat is passing by, he stops there and he unloads the things that he has, and he stores it in that house on the island. Okay, now a cave. The Gemara asks, why should a cave not expand the city? We saw elsewhere that a brisa, that Reb Chia said that a cave does expand the city. So a brisa is different. One is referring to where there's a little house at the entrance to the cave. The one's referring to where there's no house. So if there's a house, so then why are we talking about the cave? The house itself expands the borders of the city. The Gemara says, well, the house we're referring to is not big enough. It's not 4 amos by 4 amos. It's not big enough to expand the borders of the city. It's only when combined with the cave itself that it counts to expand the borders of the city. Okay, now the Gemara says, if you have a settlement, a little village made out of huts, temporary structures, that doesn't count. That doesn't count as a city at all. It's not a city, and therefore every single hut over there has only 4 amos around them, and then their 2,000 amos chum starts from there. So there's a kasha on this. When the Jews camped in the Midbar, they lived in temporary structures, and therefore that shouldn't count at all. Yet, we have a pasuk that says, "Vayachnu al Yarden mi beis ha'yeshimois, mi beis ha'yeshimois," and Rabbas Bar Chana says, "I was there, and I saw that it was 3 parsa from end to end." And the Rabbi that says that when they needed to use the bathroom, they did not use the restroom on the front or the sides of the camp, because the camp may move to the front or to the sides, and then end up in the place where they were using the bathroom. That wouldn't be fun. So instead, they all went to the back end, behind the camp, and that's where they used the restroom. How did they walk there on Shabbos? It was 3 parselis away. Obviously, they were allowed to walk there because it was all considered to be part of the city, and it was not outside their particular tchum. If each person had 4 amos and then his tchum started, then you wouldn't be able to walk to that area behind the Anani HaKavod to use the restroom. So Gemara says this is different. This is the Jews camped in the Midbar. Over there it says Al Pi Hashem Yachnu, Al Pi Hashem Yiso, that they camped based on Hashem's word. Therefore, it was considered to be permanent. Those were not temporary structures. Those were considered to be permanent structures, and therefore there's no problem. Okay, on the subject of people who live in temporary structures, the Gemara says that Rav Chanina bar Kahana says in Rav Ashi, if you have in these camps of temporary structures, you have 3 courtyards that each have at least 2 houses, that counts as a permanent area, and all the little huts there all count as permanent structures. Now Rabbi Yehuda says, and in Merav, people who live in temporary structures like these and people who wander around through the deserts, they have no life. They cannot consider themselves to be truly living, and their wives and their children are not even theirs, because there's so much trouble, it's so difficult to live such an existence. You have to assume that their wives were together with other men, and therefore their children don't belong to them, and their wives don't belong to them. Now, for Brisa that spells this out, Eliezer Ishbiria says that people who live in these temporary structures, they're like living in graveyards, and you can't marry their children about their daughters. It says, Ora Shaychiv and Kol Behema, it's like living with an animal. What's the reason? So Ula says because the reason is that they have no places to bathe, and therefore the men have to go far away to bathe, and while they're away, all kinds of troublemakers come and start up with their wives. Rabbi Yochanan says the reason is because when the women go to the mikveh, they're afraid to go by themselves, and therefore they go in groups, and the men are aware of it, and the men go and take advantage. Gemara says, what's the difference between these 2 explanations? The difference is if you have a river near the houses, and the river is fitting for tefillah, it's usable as a mikveh, but not as a place to bathe, and therefore you wouldn't have the problem of the women going to the mikveh together loudly. You would have the problem of the men going far away in order to wash themselves.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.